Thumbs up if you can hear me. I see a hand. Yes. Okay, great. All right. Welcome to our in-person plenary session with Dr. Jeremy Douglas. Jeremy is an associate professor of English at UC Santa Barbara. Dr. Douglas conducts research on interactive narrative, electronic poetry, and games with a particular focus on applying the methods of software studies, critical code studies, and information visualization to the analysis of digital text. Did I leave anything out? Take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Welcome. I'm just gonna make sure that we are you know what? I have a screen share going. Okay, that's great. Well, let's just start video just so that I'm sort of looming over my tiny icon. We'll get into play mode. If you're online and you can't see something, please holler. I seem to have left I'm gonna grab my water bottle. All right, let's get started. Writing to and from, for and against, with and without language models. I actually wish I'd put the language models part first instead of burying the lead. But by language models, I mean also ChatGPT, Bard, and Llama, Dolly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We'll talk about that. So the question I asked in my abstract was, how do we come to grips with the enormous possibility space for potential engagement with language models in writing? And by this, I partly mean that when I started doom scrolling news feeds of AI related text news a few months ago and trying to synthesize them into sets of resources, I quickly discovered a couple things, one of which was that it was very difficult to drink from the fire hose. Another was that Anna Mills was better at it than I was, and her resource pages are truly fantastic. But that it seemed to be difficult to paradigmatically decide where to put one's energy with such a huge surface for potential engagement. Like what all the different places that this touched. How do I think about tactics, given that I have limited hours in the day? So I've arrived at this reasonable anticipation, which is the premise of the engagement you will now see, that there's a future ubiquity of language models with text interfaces. They're in phones, they're embedded in apps, they're on websites, they're being run as services in the background. They're in helpful clap twice to turn off the lights assistants plugged into random, electrical outlets in airports. They're everywhere. And that in society at large, we could encounter that, for example, people thinking about this from a pedagogical perspective could anticipate that their students will enter into a world where they're not just interacting with virtual travel agents giving them plane tickets, but they're interacting with virtual colleagues, consultants, subordinates, and supervisors. In other words, that it becomes part of that textual interfaces to language models or post-language model objects become part of the writing surface of their writing life, and that it is similarly a large surface. Here we are. So I responded to this in two ways. First, to not narrow the field at all. And so I'm going to talk very briefly about yes and thinking and what it means to, rather than be overwhelmed, disengage, and turn away, to instead, as a premise, accept that maybe all of these futures are coming or are already here. And then second, to narrow radically and try to think about personas and roles as a way of interfacing with language models. And I'm going to look at that a little bit in terms of games and play. So yes, and then we're going to talk about roles, personas, role prompting, and writing polls. And then we're going to talk about a little bit about games and maybe brainstorm some games together. So when I say language model, you can't say large language model, but I just want to mark the fact that for many people, when they're talking about ChatGPT specifically, Microsoft Bing, Google Bard, Facebook Llama, Alpaca, Dolly, etc. We're thinking about large neural networks trained on very large quantities of text data. Generally, I'm thinking about ones with a text in, text out interface. So everything I say is going to apply equally to all of these kinds of objects. And I'm really interested in the ways that this kind of thinking can apply both to the latest billion-dollar mega server farm model and the one that you can run on your laptop right now, because that is indeed possible today. I want to think about a problem concept in this way. In terms of authenticity and efficiency. And authenticity, coming from electronic literature and thinking about chatbots that were sneakily getting a scientific paper published or fooling a French press into thinking that it was a novelist. Like, we've had sort of hoaxes of authenticity in generated text for, it's been 50 years now, 50 or 60 years now. Right, so it's been a long time that we've been saying, ha ha ha, the computer fooled you, you thought it was a human. But I want to think about this in a pedagogical context and about what the inauthentic exchange is. And this is the scenario that I sort of see come up over and over and over and over again. The teacher gives an assignment, the student, thank you, takes it and passes the assignment unread to an LLM. The LLM generates a response. The student takes the response, thank you, and just passes it unread right back to the instructor, who produces feedback or evaluation, which the student promptly ignores. Perfect. No learning has occurred at all, right? So this would be the kind of inauthentic exchange circuit. It looks sort of like this. It's a kind of a it's an anti-man in the middle attack, right? Where the student is in the middle, and really unbeknownst to them, the instructor is just parlaying directly with a language model, which is not learning either, right, from this exchange. Maybe a little bit of the instructor's data is being harvested. And in fact, in the maximum inauthentic version of this, the teacher, deeply alienated by the behavior in their classroom, just replaces their own feedback behavior with automatically handed off LLM generation. And then we have a group of people sitting in a classroom who are all passing each other digital documents as the machine essentially talks to itself through an elaborate set of kind of wall rebounds. Right. So this is the inauthentic scenario. It's it's both very interesting and intensely boring, right? Because it's like 0.001% of the possibility space of where language models can intersect with pedagogy. But it's one of the places where we start, right? Like, what if the circuit of authenticity is broken and no learning happens, right? So efficient exchange is another scenario I see played out often in conversation, and it goes something like this. Both the instructor and the student save time in this sort of quotidian way, like running a grammar checker or something like that, and they efficiently perform the kinds of tasks that they were already performing by using privately, internal to their own role, the LLM to kind of amplify whatever it is they're doing. I roughed out a rubric for this assignment, but I did it in 2 minutes instead of half an hour. Like, great, okay. So nothing about the exchange between the instructor and the student has been interfered with. They're keeping their there's sort of a don't ask, don't tell version of LLM in which it's going to be occurring internally to their own household. And then when in exchange with each other, they're producing these things which are amplified, augmented, or otherwise made more efficient by using the LLM as a kind of a prosthesis or an extension, right? So if you'll forgive me for a moment, I'm going to show you 4 seconds of a YouTube ad, as is traditional. And then let me see if I can get some, if I could actually get some sound going on here. Oh, no, you know what? I'm not going to do sound because I didn't even want the sound. It's just a musical montage. So this is a little clip from Real Genius. The student comes to class, then the student comes back to class, and about half of the seats, and then a third of the seats are boom boxes and tape recorders, and then 90% of the seats are tape recorders, and then 95% of the seats are tape recorders, and the student is the last student in the whole class. And then one day the student walks into the class. This is a 1980s film, and by gosh, what in the Sam Hill is going on here? Well, the professor has also been replaced by a tape player, and so all the students have left their tape players at their seats. The professor has left the tape player, and on the here we are, and on the board it says, "Math on tape is hard to follow, so please listen carefully." Right. So this is both the efficiency narrative and the inauthenticity narrative are here in spades. Tape is a different technology, and the question of time shifting the lecture hall was a different question. But you could see the way the disruptive technology, like the cassette tape and the cassette recorder, and read-write and cheap, affordable read-write audio, produce this opportunity to both rethink forms of pedagogy and say, well, what if everybody just uses this to pretend to be a student or to pretend to be a teacher, right? And as this escalates, what does it mean? So while struggling with questions like this, I want to take a sidestep into this is a QR code to my Google document, which is a little handout that I've worked on for some time. I'm also happy to share the link in the chat, or if anyone wants to pipe in, they could do that too. I just realized that I haven't actually been, I thought I had the chat open, but I haven't been getting it. There we are. Just want to make sure that if anyone's hollering for help, they're able to. But while thinking about this question of condensing resources, and I said, well, I should make a quick start guide for somebody so that they can kind of get into this in 15 minutes or half an hour or an hour. I'm thinking about my students as an audience, but also my faculty community. We're trying to educate each other. So I want to have like a key term vocabulary list. And I just started building out a set of what I consider to be useful resources, especially this kind of, if you could only read one book, if you could, or two books, or if you could only watch one video, or if you could only take one online course, what would you recommend, right? This is now like several weeks out of date, which is essentially a lifetime in AI discourse. But I think even attempting to do this at all is an interesting starting point for me, where I'm still grappling with the idea of what are the minimum entry points into this space for pedagogical engagement. And one of the things that I wanted to share was, while I was thinking, well, what are the key terms that for my colleagues and friends who had said, I don't really want to doom scroll AI news every night before I go to sleep. Like, what are the key words that you would highlight? Well, two concepts that I kept coming back to over and over again, prompt engineering was important, et cetera, but I kept coming back to these two concepts about tasks and roles. And not within the writing classroom, for example, but within AI discourse, I think a really interesting and important idea to understand about tasks is that a lot of writing about applications for language models and a lot of computer science literature about applications for language models talks about things like autocompletion, classification, extraction, generation, rewriting, translation. There are more. These are the main ones. They come up the most often. One of the interesting things about language models as a technology is that it performs fairly well at all of them. And one of the other interesting things about language models as a technology is that it does not internally distinguish them. In other words, summarizing something and translating something, extracting key details from something, or creating a new thing are all at a lower level similar to or almost the same operation, and they're done with the same stuff. ChatGPT and Bard do not have separate translation code and separate summarization code and separate generation code. They just have the network and then its tuning wrapped up in a candy-colored shell of supplemental code. So this idea that, in fact, there is no list of tasks and they are all one task and they are also every task is interesting, because instead of getting to know better and better and better what a language model can do in the way an expert knows what Photoshop can do, right? 757 submenus, each with 11 wizards and configurations. But you're not actually engaging with this as a concept of exploring a huge and complex code base. You're saying, well, what is a task? What do people do when they write or when they create text? What do I want to imagine a task is? And the role persona point was very interesting for me as well, because this role-playing or active engagement in which you take on a role and or ask the machine to take on a role. And often with an LLM, you say, you are a mathematician who loves baking cookies. Now, right? And so persona creation is a kind of a command, as if you are the MC of an improvisational comedy sport game, right? You assign them this role and then they perform. And I brought this idea of the yes and nature of the LLM when we tell it you are an astronaut with a particular interest in succulent gardens, right? Tell me about the best succulents to grow in 0G based on how beautiful they are, right? And the way you could kind of manufacture unusual or counterfactual or alien perspectives, and the way that this was both performative and playful. And I started thinking about this in relationship to the entire space, the yes and game, which so coming back to the introduction, discourse on language models is overwhelming. There are lots of key terms, concepts, and resources, and there are tons of hot takes, explainers, position papers, and the question is, well, which of these things should I listen to? How do they describe the future? And what if we played the yes and game together? In other words, to move past denial or the no but or the accept, but also move through it and into the situation where we're situating relevant approaches within the needs of specific writing contexts and communities, like my classroom. Right? So the yes and game, here's a little splash of Wikipedia, another disruptive technology that might have destroyed the classroom and or writing as we know it. There were a lot of hot takes. I thought about summarizing them, but then I'm already tired, right? You know, I just thought it's like, I'm just going to gesture at the aughts. So this rule of thumb in improvisational comedy says that you accept what the other improviser stated and then you expand on it. And I want to suggest that this accept and expand, it may not fit quite so well with these kinds of predictive questions, like, you know, will the VCR destroy the high school classroom? Like, you know, will the spell checker mean that no student will ever be able to spell again, ever, without technological assistance, right? So we could, you know, what will become of us due to the grammar checker and Google search and Wikipedia? And many of these things some of them were more or less similar to each other, but each in its own way was its own entire separate paradigmatic problem. The VCR and Google search had very little in common other than the fact that they were expected to be massively disruptive. And they were both much more and much less than people thought they would be at the time. Both. They were both much more and much less than people thought at the time. So I want to take the form of saying, you know, chat GPT is, or AI writing is, or language models are. And when I look through my Atlantic and New Yorker feed, looking for the keyword AI, or when I look through the amazing presentations that I'm seeing on the schedule for conferences like this one, I haven't been able to attend to all of them. But I want to ask, is AI writing is revolutionary and disruptive, or boring and quotidian? Yes. Yes, it absolutely, I agree. It's labor saving, making writing more efficient, and it's labor making, creating more tools that we have to master and operate at all times. Yes, it absolutely is both of those things. Is it creating a new digital divide? Yes. Is it creating new possibilities for accessibility and access? Absolutely, definitely. In translation, in summarization, in paraphrase, in on-the-fly graded reading, the possibilities are endless, and huge digital divide issues, right? Is it going to be difficult or impossible to detect? Absolutely, it's a nightmare. Most of the stuff doesn't work, and if you like working in short writing, then it's the more fool you for not assigning more than 200 words, right? Is it also potentially all marked and detectable for all time? Will people be surfacing embarrassing things that people wrote with ChatGPT this year, 20 and 30 years from now, because it's mathematically detectable using transition tables? Absolutely. It will be hilarious watching the way that ChatGPT created content is trivially detected a long time from now. Both of these things are true. Full of systematic biases, absolutely. And you can't get them out, right? Potemkin debiasing was one of my favorite coinages, and oh shoot, now I'm gonna miss this. Someone Google it for me. My brain doesn't actually have the citation in it, but this idea that that often what we do is build walls around these models to try to get them to pretend that they are not as biased as they in fact are, right? Is a fascinating and deeply troubling idea, but they are also new perspective generating engines, right? They're actually able to a surprising extent, combine, refilter, refocus, and disengage us from the normative ways of looking at particular discourse spaces, despite the fact that they are kind of normative averaging language engines. Yes, they're both economically unaffordable by all but wealthy megacorporations. Yes, they're also radically accessible and will probably be running locally on your phone soon, right? These can both be true. Nobody but 2 or 3 mega corporations will be able to run ChatGPT 7 for a while, and I can run something that's shockingly equivalent to ChatGPT 3 on my laptop literally today. They're going to require new expertise. Yes, I wish I had all the new expertise that they require. And they're going to be so easy that prompt engineering won't even be a skill at all. This is just a kind of a speed bump on our way to like radical accessibility where prompting doesn't matter. Yes. And I want to stop there for a second and nuance one part of this and just say that if we conduct a thought experiment where a future language model is beyond general AI, it's just the smartest entity to have ever existed in the universe. And it's free, and any student can access it at any time. And so you don't have to write a great prompt. You could be barely articulate because it's so darn good at figuring out what it is you want. There is one thing about prompt engineering and viz rhetoric, viz writing that I think will never go away, which is captured in a lot of the old myths about the 3 wishes or the genie, which is that underspecifying your beliefs and desires is not a tractable problem. period. No godlike entity, no all-knowing external being with any access to all of the magic of physics and the known universe can ever relieve you of the issue of needing to be able to articulate what it is you wanted. So if you don't care, like if you're like, I actually don't care what the essay says, I just want it to like be plausible and I want it to get an A, then you don't have a problem. But if you do care about what you're saying and you ask an all-powerful entity to say what you would have said, and you're not able to express yourself, then you're not actually relieved of a lot of the power of prompt engineering. In other words, auto GPT can only take us so far until it runs into something that is probably fundamental to expression. What do you believe and what do you want? And can you articulate it? If you can't, then something else will speak for you. So if everything is true and everything is possible and everything you've ever heard about ChatGPT, that it's boring and won't even make a ripple in the surface of the water and that it's going to revolutionize the world, if that's all, yes, it's all simultaneously true, then what of all of this is relevant to your practice, your writing community, your classroom? And where I went with this was personas and roles. And I want to take one moment and make sure that I have a clock. There we go. Okay. Here's what I did with that. First, people in prompt engineering talk a lot about personas and roles, and they often use the words interchangeably, and they can mean approximately the same thing. So unlike the Learn Prompting, learnprompting.org, it's an excellent free online course. They call it role prompting, and they say a role prompt is, you are Shakespeare, an English writer, write a poem. Right? This arises, and it's called prompt engineering because it's the craft, art, and science of getting the LLM to do the thing that you wanted it to do. You wanted it to write a good poem. And so then the gold standard is that everyone then writes in different prompts and you see whether you got things that the users considered to be good poems or not out. And if you did, then the prompts were better engineered. So noting that creating a role instruction was one of the ways to produce dramatically better output in lots of situations, was one of the, there are many, but it was one of the key insights of early prompt engineering work around these new models. And this idea is partly explained by the fact that your discursive register and the way that you create a performative role activates word transitions and collection of documents in the corpus that are correlated to the kinds of outputs that you want, right? So if you're activating the kinds of discourses that are by like expert gardeners, and you're writing like a gardener, or you're writing like an 18th century poet, or you're telling someone that they are an astronaut, then you may actually get better results, more factual results, or better tone or language, because you're activating the parts of the network that are related to that kind of discourse. For possibly unrelated reasons, this actually happens to humans as well. Act as an etymologist or act as an absurdist is the way that we tell an LLM, I want you to take on this persona. Now, I just wanted to feature another disruptive technology that might have changed the writing classroom as we know it, which is Google search. And in this moment, like think about if someone types in rhetoric into Google search, that they get the art of effective or persuasive speaking or writing. Prompt engineering is literally measured by its effectiveness. In other words, the art of prompt engineering is the art of stringing a series of words together such that your audience, the LLM, then does the thing that you wanted it to do, right? If you're better at doing that, you're better at prompt engineering. If you're not, you're not. So in some ways, the prompt engineering corner of computer science and software engineering has reinvented rhetoric and composition, right? So you write some words and you give them to your audience and you hope that it changes their attitudes or causes them to acquire a certain belief, or that they react in a particular way, like voting for your candidate or so on. These are, in fact, almost the same thing. In fact, if we were looking for a community of experts who had a lot of expertise in the creation of language, specifically focused on not just the creation of language in general, but the creation of language that's designed to then produce an outcome through moving the audience, we would look for people who were trained in teaching writing, right? You could argue that there's relationships to marketing, etc. But I think you'd probably say that there are so many potential applications of LLM, you want to go to the general case, which is writing across the curriculum and across the universe, right? So effective or persuasive speaking or writing. Now, where all these things come together and become interesting for me is where, when we start to think of prompt engineering as rhetoric and rhetoric as prompt engineering, and we start imagining that the writing classroom is a place where people are learning to produce text that makes things happen in the world. They're doing things with words, we might say, right? Then this alignment of the persona for the LLM and the role for the writing student becomes really, really interesting, because you could start to imagine that the classroom is a space where we can play writing games, and a student or a teacher or an LLM could play any potential role in any game, writing to and from and for and against and with each other. This maps a lot of space that people have been exploring. I want to take a moment before I go into why I think of this as a kind of a metagame that encompasses a lot of the experiments that we're seeing, but that also suggests that we can be really, really ambitious about what LLM incorporation in the classroom looks like. Not because we need more generation. I'm not necessarily convinced that we do. We might need, between 1 and 0 LLM pedagogical experiments per class, right? But that there are so many possibilities, and that the ones that are commonly being explored are more like, how do I disrupt the inauthentic circuit? Which is the most boring question you could possibly ask, when you could ask, what if anything was possible for my students? What would I do if I could literally do anything? If I could give each student a whole classroom of students to respond to an assignment that they made up, and then they could invent rubric criteria based on browsing through the instantly generated collection of papers that my LLMs performed for them, for each of them, right? In other words, if we think about roles that can be inverted and flipped, if we think about roles that can be substituted and traded, what could writing become for students who have essentially a potential cloud of writers ready to assist them on any journey exploring written language? Now, I want to distinguish student and teacher, like institutional roles, from a role in a class where you say, oh, I'm being a peer reviewer, I'm being an editor, I'm brainstorming or drafting, I'm a group lead, or I'm a researcher for a group, where the student whose institutional role endures, you can't say you're not a student, but the student is being asked to take on a particular role or activity, and that we can imagine what it looks like if LLMs are asked to do that, to be a member of the class, or a teacher of the class, or a research specialist, or a group leader, or a student of the student, etc. Right? I think I got ahead of that slide there, but let's just talk about games for a moment, and then pivot into the OpenAI interface. So this is what gets me excited. This is where I start thinking I might be able to do teaching that was literally not possible a year ago, right? Like what could I do that would be giving my students an inconceivable adventure where they come to understand what they can do with their own writing differently. And this metagame, what if you imagine richly all the different roles and activities that writing takes in your class, and then you say, or in your writing community, and then you say, what would it mean for an LLM to act in any role or as any persona? And then what would that also mean for for forums, for instant writing, for editing and feedback and compilation, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What if I took any one of these places and I replaced it with ChatGPT? What would happen then? So here's an example of a game, and we're entering into a moment where I want to briefly brainstorm with people, and then I want to ask for suggestions or ideas or games. Maybe they're not called games to you that you've already heard of or that you've tried, and have a brief conversation about that. So the breakdown game works like this. The whole class is playing. The LLM has been called up to the board and it's doing performative writing. It just writes way faster than any human being does, right? In the breakdown game, you start out and you give it its short assignment, right? Write 200 words about your favorite pet. And now each student in the class, the rule is that they just have to break the writing process down further. Come up with a topic about your pet. Come up with an outline for the great things about your pet. Organize the outline of the great things about your pet. Give the reason why you organized the outline. Pick the weakest object in the outline and replace it with a stronger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we go through elaborating and elaborating and elaborating and breaking down, drafting, revising, et cetera. And the model just keeps generating and regenerating and regenerating as it goes through an increasingly elaborated set of steps that the class is imagining as they try to break apart a writing process into as many steps as they could possibly imagine, which they can reorganize into any order. The super student game involves an LLM who's been added to the forum. They are known to be the LLM student, but the super student takes suggestions from every other student in class and how to approach every assignment. I like having an LLM student in my class who tries to do all of the work of the class in public, because I think it's an interesting way of making the students aware of what LLMs doing assignment work looks like. And also they're aware that they're each seeing it and they're seeing me seeing it, right? But the super student is a little bit different in that what you do with them is you give them a huge number of options. You should write your paper about this, says everybody in the forum. And then we ask the LLM to choose. In other words, the performative quality of the LLM is that it's actually existing in a community where it has, in my case, 42 teachers, who are all the other students who are soft mentoring it on every single assignment, right? And then we just talk about the outcomes. Often it may perform quite poorly, but that's interesting, right? The goal is the goal is not a kind of rhetorical triumph. The goal is exploration. Hallucination is very important to understand in LLMs, and in the hallucination game, much like Balderdash or other BS games. The goal for the student is to catch the LLM saying incorrect things about the course materials or sources. And the goal for the LLM is to catch the students. Students also hallucinate. We don't call it that. They make mistakes. They forget. They take the incorrect note. They don't do the reading and then say that they did, right? But transforming a kind of a gentler way of saying, okay, try to ask the LLM a question about today's material and let's see if anyone can get it to say something that's not true. How did we know it was not true? How did we catch it? How do we check? Okay, give the LLM the LLM student all of the student posts for today's forums. Is there anything that it takes issue with, acting as a fact checker? Is there anything that you put in that was not true that you fooled it? That's how you win at Balderdash, right? So it's a way of taking the idea LLMs hallucinate and therefore we cannot trust them with stuff that is consequential, and to actually get into the nitty gritty of what it means to deal with hallucination in an applied way. There's more. I think I actually want to pivot shortly before so we can get into have time to get into questions. But I want to just say that the style game is based on my experiences recently thinking about moving from teaching MLA style to teaching BBC radio format style in my recent history of audiobooks class. And that thinking about actually having students make up a simple arbitrary style, and then they attempt to teach the LLM student how to write in that style. This is a very common thing to actually want to do, document formatting and document presentation, but it gets you really into the weeds with citation, also the difference between explaining something as a set of specifications and rules and modeling it as a set of examples. So when a group of students who can also be broken into teams and say, all right, you've all got your style, you're each going to try to spend the next 15 minutes teaching your LLM how to produce documents in that style. And then we're going to come back and talk about what worked and what didn't, and what got good results and how, right? In some ways, this is leaning into the things that LLMs already do quite well, but again, removing the mystery of saying, oh, it can write a Shakespearean sonnet, and getting into something where you say all styles and all formats are invented, all of them are created, all of them are arbitrary, but many of them are specified. How do we create and then communicate something like this outside the training data? How do we empower people to think about style when they're interacting with LLMs? The Mary Poppins game involves inventing either an assignment or a teacher. You may recall in film Mary Poppins that the Banks children and Mr. Banks each put out an advertisement for the perfect nanny. Lo and behold, they have completely different ideas about who the perfect nanny is. Well, an LLM is a really strange and interesting thing. It's persona driven, extremely persona driven. And so you could have both the teacher and the students write descriptions of their ideal mentor or tutor or writing assistant for the class. What characteristics would it have? What expertise would it have? What things would it focus on while giving feedback? And what we end up with is essentially a conversation between people with different perspectives on what writing assistants should look like, that is performed in an applied way through imagining and inventing your ideal nanny, right? Your ideal writing tutor, right? And then, you know, we could talk about how those systems work and if they work, right? I'll actually just move on a little bit because I think misregistering, we could talk about group work, we could talk about work where every student in the class writes something and then as if they were all contributing to a major end of year report for a corporation, and now they have to advocate for the little bits of the summary of their paper to make it through the summarization process. So in other words, rather than making the LLM subordinate to all of the students, make it superior to all of the students, and then make them advocate for themselves when one document is being created out of every piece of writing that all of the student did. These tend to involve process-based learning. We could talk about what evaluation would look like. But the goal in general of thinking about roles, thinking about the alignment with rhetoric and prompt engineering, and then thinking about the way that that opens up a possibility space, not just for the LLM to take on roles that already existed in the classroom, but for it to do things that weren't possible before. Like, I'm going to hire 10 different imaginary writing tutors and let the students shop them around. I'm going to give each of my students a class of students that they are supervising, right? I'm going to create several imaginary groups, all populated by language model generation, and then think about the way the students circulate through them while they try to find the community that they want to be writing within. These are the sorts of things that you could imagine somebody who could hire 50 or 100 or 200 people could create a kind of a strange, bespoke writing community experience. But we're at the cusp of a place where we can just imagine things being possible and then try them out. They will be partial. The LLMs are not people or artificial intelligences. Their personas are not positionalities that make them like an authentic student, but they're engineered to play a role. And so it's a moment where we can revisit what role playing can do for writing rather than what writing should do to escape role playing. That's it. I'm open to take questions, and I hope you enjoyed it. Oh, and I see I'm just gonna looking at the bottom of the chat. I see the supercut game. It's not referring to Supercuts, the affordable hair salon. It's referring to the video Supercut, and so somewhat like the executive summary game, the Supercut game is a game in which the goal of the LLM is going to be to create a supercut of all the students' papers on a specific topic or theme. So the goal of the student becomes to be selected during the summarization process. There are variations on this. There are variations on this game, and you can play it either with a set of student writings that were written with that in mind, or you can play it after the fact, which then means that the students are then saying, hey, the supercut should really be about violence, or the supercut should really be about like food, because it relates to aspects of their writing. I think that for me, one of the interesting things about thinking about LLMs in the workplace and beyond in the kind of next 10 to 20 years is that AI supervisory functions are going to be a thing. In other words, learning to write above the LLM is super important, but our students are also going to need to think tactically about how to write below the LLM in an org chart style sense. And these are the kinds of games I came up with when I was playing with org charts and dropping little pictures of students and little gears on them. So I look forward to the supercut hair game. Actually, I've been playing the pandemic hair game recently, but I'll have a nice wig to donate soon, and I might just do it at Supercuts. Yes, so I'm open to questions from the audience. I'm trying to look at the webinar chat here. Can we see those org charts? Yes, you can see some of them. Although I'm actually in this brief moment, I'll follow up and I'll share some resources. But I want to actually suggest something. Whoa, I hope that YouTube wasn't blasting into the online audio the entire time. I didn't know that was playing. What I would like to highlight about that, and let's go. I have far too many tabs open. Yes, here we go. Okay, so this is actually something that I would recommend, and I'll provide a sample of. So if you're familiar with either GraphViz or Mermaid, you can actually write tiny flowcharts. So don't take mine, like brainstorm your own, right? And so if you decide that there's actually, going to be a mentor in your game. And we'll just type a little arrow here, and we'll say that that's going to go to student 2. And there's a little icon that you can drop in. I'm going to use the gear here. I actually, it was silly of me, but I actually should have given the gear to the mentor. There we go. You can use the Mermaid Live Editor, and just kind of cut and paste and type and draw little arrows in a text document, and brainstorm kind of as many graphs as you want and edit them on the fly. I know this may not be appealing to some people who live inside a vector-based editing software or use Adobe Creative Suite. But it is also kind of nice because one of the things that very simple text formats like GraphViz do is that LLMs can write them. So you can provide an LLM with a few dozen examples of a set of roles connected by little arrows like this using this format, which it has tens of thousands of examples it's already been trained on. And then it can draw pictures for you in this style as it brainstorms new forms of games or suggests edits to the games that you already have. OmniGraffle is awesome. And I really like YEd Online for drawing flowcharts, but consider, Mermaid or GraphViz and something like this, and then your AI can get in on the action. Have I tried any of these games? What do you think is the most fun, and what do you think is the most instructive? Well, a number of them I have not yet tried. So let's start there. Many of these are ideation. And I'm trying to provide them in an open way rather than an applied way, because I'm trying not to avoid making too many assumptions about other people's needs. I have done a number. One of the very first ones I did, this was actually January. It might have been February. That partly drove me into this process was I did the mentor any assignment, right? So any assignment on my syllabus, what I want you to do is go open up a session with an AI, and I want you to, without doing any of the writing yourself, explain to the AI how to fully complete the assignment. So the only rule is you're like a mentor to another student. You're not allowed to write for them. That would be unethical. You can unpack the assignment, you can paraphrase it, you can give them feedback on drafts, you can suggest connections. And what I want you to do when you get to the end, this was initially, it was an extra credit add-on to literally any assignment in the class. And I just said on the first day, if you want extra credit on any assignment all quarter long, I did that this quarter too. If you want extra credit on any assignment all quarter long, then what I want you to do is just lead an LLM through the assignment, comment on what happened, and just turn the transcript into me. I don't want the final result, that's fine, but I'm more interested in learning about your process. One of the things that I found that was useful for this kind of assignment, and it's very undercooked because in a way I wasn't sure what I wanted yet. I just wanted to engage. But one of the things that's very useful about this format of assignment is that if you cut and paste, like say a ChatGPT chat, or use one of the export forms, there are plugins for this too, like Markdown, you can get it into Google Docs, and then you can have the students just highlight and comment, highlight and comment, highlight and comment. They can also drop it into Microsoft Word and do the same thing. So using the standard editorial kind of speech bubble idiom is a great way to get the student to spend a little while writing with the LLM and produce a several page transcript, and then go through and add bubbles and add comments. Because the interface to ChatGPT keeps changing, the best way, the best way on any given week to actually cut and paste a ChatGPT transcript into a doc keeps changing. So that's been unpleasant because I have to stay on top of that, and every week or two I have to fix it or give new advice. But I think when that stabilizes, that's my ground zero sidecar AI, which doesn't require is tunable to almost any assignment very easily.
About I feel like it's got a clear idea of where the goals fit into.
Yes.
The different exercises. So again, I really like that. Writing activities as conceived as a role. What do you imagine happens when you start to encourage the students to play on different personas for AI fulfilling that role, whether it's sort of a writing process, a revision process.
So you mean the student taking on a persona like in a net prov, or you mean the
telling okay, now is it just as important to say, okay, now AI, you're the
yeah, absolutely. No. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's actually one of the core advantages of the technology. It's the biggest way for me that the metaphor with like spell checking and grammar checking and other kinds of augmentation sort of falls flat, because embedded in the neural network is this deep sociality context for language. And so, yes, it's infinitely more interesting to be writing to be writing an application for a skeptical audience, or to be writing an application for an audience who is biased towards a certain kind of candidate, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the fact that you can potentially create peer reviewers or create advocate students in class who are not students, but are acting as proxies for particular perspectives, and so you say, well, on behalf of the oil industry and based on the fact that my family works in it, I think we haven't been talking about X, right? So I have a set of student games that some of which can become a little bit, you have to tread very carefully when you're instructing a system or a student to speak on behalf of anyone. But because in essence, that's what an LLM is always doing, you can say, what are the perspectives that are missing from this community of voices at this moment? How would we describe our understanding of that lack? And then when we ask the LLM to generate examples of those kinds of perspectives, what does it say, and do we find that convincing, right? So that's a way to not only create like adverse or friendly audiences for your writing, but to create people who join the writing community, which is really the LLM filtering the kinds of voices that are not already in the classroom. I didn't get to scroll all the way back on the questions, but are we at time actually? I think well, I see one more in the room. Yeah.
Firstly, thank you so much, Jeremy. Your presentation was fascinating and really opened my mind up in lots of different ways. I'm curious to hear from you about your students' engagement around ChatGPT, particularly in terms of sort of their political engagement with the world. Given that many of the biggest challenges that we face, from the environment to queer rights, are in part rhetorical problems, but the voices of reactionary news network.
Right.
Ministers on Sunday morning are in certain areas more persuasive than the voices of advocates for justice. Do students see any kind of conflict about this technology there?
Yeah.
Power that affects change?
So some of my students are they're all coming up to speed at different levels, and I think for many of them their engagement is more pragmatic than conceptual, right? They're going to start using it first, and they're going to come to know what it means for them through direct experience, not through kind of they're not a kind of a media theory nerd or a writing studies nerd, right? But for some of them, I had a conversation with a student whose plan is to become a high school English teacher. So for her, like her concept, she says, clearly this is going to have a big impact on my life. I don't know what it is yet, but what I want to know is, like, what will this mean if I'm now teaching writing in a way that is not the way I learned writing? So that's not quite to talk about like amplifying advocate voices, but I think it's a very insightful, it's something I should have asked myself, actually, right? But it's a really insightful way of kind of getting at the fact that, you know, you have someone who hasn't graduated from college yet, who's already thinking about a generation gap before their very first year of you know, even doing classroom interning, right? So in that way, the worry that I have about authenticity is that the kind of inauthentic circuit run wild is that part of the educational community turns away or attempts to retrench. It's deeply inauthentic, and it turns these traditional assignments into performative writing, which is not actually engaged writing. And I'm partly paraphrasing our much better keynote on this point earlier. And that situation could so easily be exacerbated, not that you must use LLMs in your classroom or else you're inauthentic, but that students can so easily be drawn into a position where they feel that their writing environment that's being simulated in their classroom has no relationship to the writing environment they anticipate in their social and working life, right? So there is where that for me is where the authenticity comes in, is that for many of my students, they already feel as college students that they are old souls on the other side of a generation gap that's suddenly opening right now, right? And I think if we just keep that feeling in mind, then we can think about how to serve them ethically with, you know, with that in mind. It's how time is. I don't want to rush off. If people have more questions, I hope that you will also. I'm gonna put up again my my contact information if anyone wants to hang out and brainstorm games with me for a few minutes, or you know, on a channel or in the Discord, or send me a carrier pigeon. I'll be sharing my slides with the community, and that the link to the handout.
Here's the list of games.
And yes, absolutely. And the list of games is also going to be in the slide. It's slides, but there's a much bigger list with prose descriptions. I think the thing to keep in mind about the games is the metagame, right? What are the roles and what becomes possible when you can invent roles, create community of roles, and flip roles at will? And then just ask, what, if any of that fits into the needs of your authentic writing community and situation? And anything that doesn't is not your problem. A lot of us are trying to drink from the fire hose, but actually there might be one perfect thing for you, or it might be nothing at all. And that could be okay too. Be well, and thank you for being with this conference with me.
Online summary will be shown in here. 3 o'clock.